The Friday night rush at Metropolitan General was a relentless storm of flashing sirens and urgent footsteps. Amidst the clinical chaos, one woman moved like a shadow. Nurse Elena Ward was invisible by choice, a quiet figure gliding between monitors and gurneys. Nobody called her name. Nobody asked for her opinion. She was just a background character in a world of high-speed medicine. But when a critical trauma case arrived and the elite team missed a life-threatening detail, the shadow finally stepped into the light. In that single heartbeat, she proved that the most powerful voice in the room is the one listening. The truth awaits. Elena Ward was 30 years old, but in the sterile, high-pressure world of the emergency room, she often felt like a ghost haunting the polished hallways. She had been at the hospital for 3 years, yet many of the senior surgeons still didn't know her last name. They called her the nurse with the T, or simply pointed with a gloved finger when they needed a tray cleared or a mess mopped up. Elna didn't mind the neglect. She was a woman who found comfort in the corners, a dedicated professional who believed that the best work was often done without a sound or a request for praise. The ER was a theater of the loud and the fast. To her colleagues, Elena was simply reliable. That was the polite word they used when they meant she was unremarkable. She wasn't like Sarah, the head nurse who could bark orders like a drill sergeant and move mountains of bureaucracy with a single glare. She wasn't like Marcus, the charismatic resident who was already being groomed for a chief position by the department heads. Elena was the one who checked the equipment manifest twice after everyone else had signed off. She was the one who made sure the emergency carts were stocked to the exact centimeter. She was the silent engine that kept the ship moving while everyone else fought for a turn at the wheel. In the hierarchy of a high-volume trauma center, attention is a currency. The loudest voices get the most resources. The flashiest saves get the morning praise. Elena, with her soft-spoken nature and her habit of blending into the eggshell white paint of the hospital walls, had a zero balance in that economy. People looked through her, not at her. They saw the blue scrubs, the plastic badge, and the digital clipboard. But they never saw the analytical mind that was constantly recording every flicker of a patient's eyelid or every subtle hitch in their breathing. She occupied the support role, the person who held the hand of a terrified, crying child, while the real doctors focused on the broken bone. She was the one who fetched the warm blankets for the elderly and updated the endless insurance files that no one else wanted to touch. Her efficiency was so seamless that it became effectively invisible. Like the oxygen in the room, nobody noticed it was there until it was gone. The hallway lighting always felt a bit too bright, reflecting off the linoleum in a way that made Elena want to squint. But she didn't. She kept her eyes open, absorbing every detail of her environment. She noticed the way the janitor favored his right leg. She noticed the flickering light in room 7 that had been reported but not fixed. She noticed the way the head surgeon's hands shook slightly after his third double espresso. She was a witness to the human condition in its most raw state. Her shift usually followed a predictable rhythm. A series of minor crises, broken fingers, drunken stumbles, and the occasional feverish infant, followed by a steady flow of paperwork and the occasional nod of acknowledgement from a passing colleague who had forgotten she had been standing there for 6 hours straight. She didn't seek the spotlight. She didn't join the loud, ego-driven gossip in the break room. She spent her 15-minute breaks in the rooftop garden, watching the city lights and listening to the rhythmic hum of the world breathing outside the sterile glass. The other nurses sometimes joked that Elena was part of the furniture. "Hey, Elena, can you grab the vitals on bed 4 while I take my lunch?" they would ask, already turning their backs before she could even offer an answer. She would just nod, her eyes already moving to the next task on the screen. She knew they didn't mean to be unkind. They were just busy, caught in the profound tunnel vision that happens when you're fighting death every single day and can only see the fire right in front of you. But being invisible has its hidden advantages. When nobody's looking at you, you have the absolute freedom to look at everything else. Elena saw the things the stars missed. She saw the subtle signs of infection that the interns ignored in their rush to discharge a bed. She was the silent witness to the tiny cracks in the system that could eventually lead to a collapse. She was the invisible nurse, a title she wore with a quiet, humble pride that needed no validation. She didn't need a plaque on the wall or a shout-out at the morning briefing. She only needed to know that she was there, ready and watching, waiting for the one moment when the noise of the world would stop and the truth would finally need a voice to save a life. If you think some people become invisible simply because they don't seek attention, comment, "That is unfair." The shift changed at 10 p.m., and the energy in the ER shifted with it. A massive multi-car accident on the interstate had sent the trauma bay into a frantic, adrenaline-fueled frenzy. Sirens were no longer distant sounds. They were a constant, piercing scream that vibrated through the very floorboards of the building. The air in the bay was thick with the scent of ozone, damp asphalt, and the heavy metallic tang of fresh blood. In the center of the storm was Bed 1. A high-priority patient had just arrived, a male in his mid-40s, a prominent local figure who had been T-boned at high speed. The elite trauma team swarmed the gurney before it even stopped moving. Dr. Sterling, the lead surgeon with a reputation for perfection, was already shouting for a chest tube and a full imaging series. "Blood pressure is dropping. Get the O-neg ready now," Sterling barked, his face a mask of intense focus. "I need a secondary survey. Let's move, people. Every second we lose is blood he doesn't have." Elena was there, of course, but as usual, she was on the extreme periphery. She was the one hanging the IV bags in the shadow of the monitor, the one clearing the blood-soaked gauze from the floor so the doctors wouldn't slip. She was the quiet pair of hands ensuring the high-tech equipment didn't fail in the heat of the moment. While the team focused on the massive, life-threatening laceration on the patient's leg and the unstable, crushing chest injury, Elena was looking at the patient's face. She noticed something the others didn't have the time to see, a tiny, almost imperceptible twitch in his left cheek. She noticed the way his neck muscles were straining, not in a way that signaled physical pain, but in a way that signaled a neurological mismatch, a deep-seated malfunction in the brain's communication with the body. The team was moving at light speed. They were following the trauma protocol to the letter. Airway, breathing, circulation. They checked the boxes with surgical precision and practiced speed. "Lungs are clear," Marcus shouted over the noise of the suction machine. "The leg is the primary source of blood loss. Prepare for a rapid sequence intubation to stabilize his breathing." But Elena stayed focused on that one small, persistent detail. She looked at the patient's pupils again as the light hit them. They were reactive, yes, but there was a sluggishness in the left eye that didn't match the right. It wasn't a classic sign of a massive stroke or a standard traumatic brain injury. It was something much more subtle, a whisper of a brewing disaster that the textbooks rarely covered in the first chapter. The pressure in the room was suffocating, a physical weight on everyone's shoulders. Every second mattered, and the clock on the wall seemed to be ticking faster than usual. Sterling was focused entirely on the femoral artery. Marcus was focused on the ventilator settings. They were looking at the big things, the loud things, the things that looked like they would kill the man in the next 30 seconds. Elena moved closer to the head of the bed, risking the wrath of the senior staff. She wanted to be sure. She watched the cardiac monitor closely. The rhythm was steady, but the wave of the pulse was starting to flatten in a very specific, ominous pattern. It was a sign of a rare cardiovascular reaction to the specific type of trauma the man had sustained. A condition that looked like a simple drop in pressure, but was actually an electrical failure of the heart's pacing system. If they pushed the standard medications for intubation now, the paralytics and the sedatives, the patient's heart would likely enter a state of total arrest, and it wouldn't come back. She looked at her colleagues. They were sweating, shouting, and moving with a frantic, heroic energy. They were saving him with everything they had, using every bit of their elite training, but they were missing the one small, frayed wire that was about to snap and turn their success into a tragedy. Elena took a breath, feeling the familiar, heavy weight of her own invisibility. If she spoke, would they even hear her? Or would they see her as just another support nurse getting in the way of a real doctor's life-saving work. She looked at the patient's twitching cheek again. She saw the flattening wave on the monitor. She knew she only had a 5-second window before they pushed the plunger on the paralytics. The room felt like it was closing in. The sounds of the monitors, the shouting, and the sirens outside merged into a single, chaotic hum. The elite were handling the big things, but the life of the man on the bed was currently hiding in the small things. And Elena was the only one in the room who had been quiet enough to hear them screaming for help. If you realize small details can carry big consequences, comment, I was wrong. The syringe was ready, filled with the chemicals that would paralyze the patient's muscles so the doctors could breathe for him. Marcus had his hand on the plunger, looking to Dr. Sterling for the final authoritative nod. Administering the paralytics in 3, 2, wait! The word wasn't a scream. It wasn't a panicked shout of fear. It was a firm, resonant, and absolute command that cut through the beeping of the machines and the heavy rhythmic breathing of the trauma team like a surgical blade. The room went suddenly eerily silent. Every head turned in unison. Dr. Sterling looked up from the leg he was stitching, his brow furrowed in a mixture of confusion and sudden anger. Marcus froze, his fingers still hovering over the syringe, his heart rate spiking at the interruption. They all looked at Elena Ward. The invisible nurse was standing at the head of the bed, her hand placed firmly but gently over Marcus's wrist. "What are you doing, Ward?" Sterling barked, the veins in his neck beginning to bulge. "We don't have time for a break. Push the meds before we lose his airway." "No," Elena said, her voice steady as a heartbeat, radiating a calm that seemed to anchor the room. "Look at the monitor, not the numbers. Look at the waveform transition." "The blood pressure is low, Elena." "We all know that," Marcus snapped, trying to pull his arm back from her grip. "That's why we're stabilizing him. Move your hand." "It's not just the pressure," Elena countered, her eyes never leaving Sterling's, forcing him to engage with her observation. "The wave is flattening at the peak. Look at the T-wave transition, and look at his face. He has a unilateral facial twitch that wasn't there when we started the survey. This isn't just hemorrhagic shock from the leg wound. He has a carotid dissection that's triggering a vagal response. If you push those paralytics now, his heart will enter a refractory period it won't ever come back from. You'll be intubating a corpse." Sterling blinked. The anger in his eyes was replaced by a sharp, clinical curiosity. He looked at the monitor. He looked at the specific waveform Elena was pointing to with her free hand. Then he looked at the patient's face, really looking for the first time as a diagnostic investigator rather than a technician. The twitch was there, faint, rhythmic, and undeniable. "A carotid dissection?" Sterling whispered to himself. His mind was already calculating the physics of the high-speed crash, the seatbelt, the specific angle of the T-bone impact on the driver's side. He would have a carotid brute if that were true. He reached for his stethoscope, his movements no longer frantic but precise. He pressed it against the patient's bruised neck, leaning in close. The room held its breath. The only sound was the muffled, distant siren of another ambulance arriving in the bay outside. Sterling's eyes widened behind his glasses. "He's right, she's right. There's a profound turbulence in the flow. My God, Marcus, stop." He looked at Marcus with a look of pure realization. "Abort the intubation protocol, switch to a vasopressor-only protocol, and get the neurosurgeon down here on a code red. If we had pushed those meds, his heart would have coded before the tube even hit the trachea." The atmosphere in the room didn't just change, it completely inverted. The frantic, ego-driven energy of the last 10 minutes vanished, replaced by a cold, surgical focus that was almost meditative. The team pivoted as one. They stopped the standard trauma protocol and began the highly specialized intervention for a carotid trauma and electrical heart failure. Elena didn't say another word of instruction. She didn't need to. She stepped back into the shadows, allowing Marcus and Sterling to do the work they were trained for. She went back to her corner, adjusting the IV lines and quietly clearing the discarded plastic packaging from the floor. She was back to being a shadow, but the shadow had just redirected a bullet that was destined for a man's heart. For the next 20 minutes, the trauma bay was a symphony of elite, coordinated medicine. The neurosurgeon arrived and confirmed Elena's suspicion. The dissection was stabilized with a delicate temporary stent. The blood pressure began to climb steadily, not because of a standard fluid push, but because they had finally addressed the electrical failure Elena had identified in the silence. Throughout the entire process, the team worked in a hushed, respectful silence. Every few minutes, Marcus or Sterling would glance toward Elena as she worked in the periphery. They were looking for her now. They were looking for the person who had been quiet enough to see what they were too busy to notice. The patient was finally wheeled out of the bay toward the operating suite. He was stable. He was breathing on his own. And most importantly, his heart was beating with a strong, healthy rhythm. As the gurney disappeared through the swinging double doors, the trauma team stood in the middle of the wreckage of gauze, plastic wrappers, and discarded gloves. They were exhausted, covered in sweat, and processing the profound reality of what had just happened. Dr. Sterling took off his surgical gloves, his hands trembling slightly with the aftershocks of the adrenaline. He looked at the empty bed, then he looked at Elena, who was already starting to mop the floor and prepare the bay for the next arrival. "Ward, Urano," he said, his voice no longer a bark of command, but a quiet, humbled tone that carried through the room. Elena stopped her work and looked up, her expression as neutral as ever. "Yes, doctor." "How did you see it?" he asked, genuinely searching for an answer. "We were all looking right at him. We have decades of experience between us. How did you see the twitch from the back of the room?" Elena gave a small, tired, but genuine smile. "You were looking at the life-threatening injury, doctor. I was just looking at the man. Someone has to watch the person behind the trauma." Sterling nodded slowly, the weight of his own oversight finally pressing down on him in the quiet. "Good catch." "No, that wasn't just a catch. That was a save. I'm sorry I didn't listen to you sooner, Elena. I really am." Elena just nodded once and went back to cleaning the floor. She didn't need the apology. She didn't need the public recognition. She only needed to know that the man in bed one was going home to his family because she had chosen to pay attention. She was the invisible nurse again, but the very walls of the ER seemed to remember her name now, and they whispered it with respect. If you believe speaking up at the right moment can change outcomes, comment, "I am indebted." The news of the invisible nurse's save spread through the hospital over the next few days like a low-frequency hum. It wasn't a loud, dramatic story told over the intercom. It was a whisper that made people stop in the hallways and think about their own work. In the cafeteria, the senior surgeons stopped talking about their weekend golf scores and started talking about the carotid dissection in Bay 1. "Did you hear about Ward?" they would ask, leaning over their trays. She stopped Sterling mid-procedure, saw a T-wave shift from 5 feet away through a crowd of people. For the first time in 3 long years, Elena felt the eyes of her colleagues on her as she walked through the halls to start her shift. It wasn't the dismissive, see-through gaze she was used to. It was a gaze of intense curiosity and newfound hard-earned respect. Marcus caught up with her near the pharmacy station a few days later. He looked different than he had before the accident. Less arrogant, more thoughtful, and his posture was less rigid. "Elena," he said, using her first name with a deliberate, warm inflection, "I wanted to thank you again. I've been reading up on that specific waveform shift every night since. I would have missed it completely. I would have killed him." "We all miss things when we're under that much pressure, Marcus," Elena replied simply, her voice as calm as a morning lake. "That's why we're a team. We're each other's safety net." "But you weren't under that pressure," Marcus noted, shaking his head in wonder. "You were, I don't know, you were somewhere else entirely." "I was observing," she said softly. "Observation is a form of intensive care too. Sometimes it's the most important form." The shift in perception didn't just happen with the high-ranking doctors. The other nurses started seeking her out in the break room. "Elena, can you take a quick look at the patient in bed 6? Something feels off about his breathing, but I can't put my finger on it. I trust your eyes over the machine right now." Elena didn't change her personality. She didn't become a loud, demanding leader. She didn't demand a promotion or a higher salary. She continued to do the T-runs for the night shift. She continued to double-check the equipment manifests, and she continued to be the quietest person in the room during a crisis. But her invisibility had been replaced by a different kind of presence. She was now the anchor, the fixed point people looked to when the noise of the ER got too loud to bear. A week later, the patient from bed 1 was finally discharged. He was a man of immense power and influence in the city, but as he left the hospital, he didn't ask to see the chief of surgery or the board of directors to give a donation. He asked for the nurse who saw the twitch. Pointement. They found Elena in the supply closet, meticulously counting out stacks of gauze pads for the next shift. When she walked out, the man took her hand in both of his. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. The look in his eyes was a debt that could never be settled with money, plaques, or public speeches. "You were the only one who really saw me in that room," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Elena squeezed his hand back gently. "That's my job," she said softly. "I saw you." As he walked away with his family, Elena felt a strange, satisfying sense of closure. She realized that recognition didn't have to be a bright spotlight or a loud applause. It could be a simple, private thank you from a person who was still breathing and alive because you chose to pay attention when no one else was. She went back to the supply closet. She went back to her checklists. She went back to being the woman who didn't seek attention. But as she worked, she realized that she was no longer a shadow. She was a light that didn't need to roar or scream to be seen. She was a guardian of the small things. The ER was still a storm. It was still a place of sirens and blood and frantic, exhausting energy. But in the center of that storm, there was now a fixed point of peace. A nurse who knew that the most important part of the job wasn't the noise you made to prove you were working. It was the silence you kept so you could hear the heartbeat of the truth. If you believe recognition often comes after the moment, comment, "I will live kindly." The story of Elena Ward is a vital, timeless reminder that in a world obsessed with volume and speed, the quietest people are often the most important assets in the room. We live in a culture that rewards the stars, the ones who speak the loudest, the ones who take up the most physical space, the ones who crave the spotlight above all else. We are taught from a young age that to be successful, we must be seen by as many people as possible. But true excellence isn't about being seen, it's about seeing the world with clarity. Elena proved that invisibility is not a lack of power, it is a profound concentration of it. By choosing not to compete for the center of attention, she gained the mental clarity to observe the world as it truly was, unfiltered by ego or distraction. She saw the twitch because she wasn't looking at herself. She heard the silence because she wasn't listening to the sound of her own voice. We often overlook the Elena Wards in our own lives. At work, in our families, and in our communities. We see the quiet colleagues who always hit their deadlines without complaining. The unassuming neighbors who keep their lawns tidy. The people who work in the background of every great achievement, and we assume they are ordinary. We judge them by their silence, mistaking it for weakness, a lack of ambition, or a lack of skill. But behind those quiet eyes is often a level of mastery that would put the stars to shame if it were ever fully revealed. There are skills built in the deep shadows, lessons learned through years of profound observation, and a kind of courage that doesn't need an audience to exist. You don't need a bright spotlight to have a massive, life-changing impact on the world around you. You don't need a podium to lead others toward the truth. You only need the clarity to see the truth when it's hiding in the small things, and the courage to step up and speak when that truth finally needs a voice to save the day. Elena didn't win a promotion or a gold medal in that trauma bay. She won a human life, and in doing so, she fundamentally changed the way an entire hospital looked at the concept of support staff. She reminded the experts that the person mopping the floor or checking the gauze might be the one holding the key to the next miracle. The next time you find yourself in a room full of noise and ego, don't just look for the person shouting the loudest to be heard. Look for the person who is watching. Look for the one who is listening to the rhythm of the room instead of the sound of their own self-importance. They might not have the flashy title. They might not have the public recognition, but they might just be the one who saves everything when the moment of crisis finally arrives. Be the observer in your own life. Be the one who pays attention to the small things that others are too busy to notice. Because in the end, it's not what you tell the world you are that matters. It's what you do when the world stops making sense, and only the silent, hidden truth remains. Real strength is quiet, real leadership is clear, and real heroes don't need you to know their names. They only need the mission to be complete and the world to be a little bit safer. That is the lasting power of the invisible nurse. And that is a lesson we should all carry into the dark when the sirens start to scream and the world begins to tilt. Be the anchor. Be the shadow that sees. Be the truth. Final CTA. If you believe the people who quietly observe and act at the right moment deserve recognition, leave a comment below. And if this story reminds you that even one small moment can change everything, don't forget to subscribe for more.